everybody. This is Matt with State of Flux. Pull up a chair. We're going to talk about Star Trek Picard, Season 2. Once upon a time, there was a show called Star Trek. It was a space fantasy show. A show that was infused with a sense of hopeful optimism. It was a show that was inspiring. A hero who was not only a swashbuckling rogue, but also a competent captain. This show was so inspiring that it would literally go to change the future. What once was fantasy started to become bits and pieces of our reality. It stopped being so much of a space fantasy and more of a science fiction traditional show. It would give way to Star Trek: The Next Generation, which was much more firmly ingrained in its science fiction storytelling, but nonetheless infused with that hopeful sense of optimism and that ever looking to the future. That was a show captained by a completely different character, a Jean-Luc Picard, who was not so much a swashbuckler, not so much a rogue, but a truly compelling captain who was always competent and always learning from his travels, his treks through these stars. And both of these shows, and the spin-offs that came from them, be it animated spin-offs, be it feature films, be it a handful of TV shows, they all catered to this. They used contemporary issues and was able to contextualize them and comment on them through fantasy and science fiction means in this distant future. But somewhere along the way, this franchise lost its way. It stopped looking forward and got stuck looking behind. It started going backwards. And it was no longer commenting on what was going on in any contemporary means. It started to try and contextualize and flesh out lore, which at the end of the day doesn't serve anything but to root out inconsistencies with its own narrative. But this was never a narrative-driven show. But in 2017, 2018, I got excited a little bit because for the first time in over 10 years, we were getting a show that was looking back towards that future, looking to boldly go in Star Trek Picard. Now, it wasn't a huge leap forward, but it was forward nonetheless. And so I got excited a little bit. And that first season came out 2020, and well, it's good. It certainly has its ups, but it also does have some of its downs. It landed more positively for me than anything else because it did. It ventured straight ahead. Star Trek Picard Season 2 is the darkest timeline of Star Trek. It started to play with storylines and ideas that we had already made peace with. And it went back and essentially is homogenizing lore that we already know. It does, and refuting direct lore that we also have already come to understand, which is the very nature of why doing like prequel shows is kind of not necessarily a great idea when it's not necessary part of the storytelling process. Star Trek Picard Season 2 is the darkest timeline for Star Trek anything in the sense that it's needless and frustrating. I wasn't even going to review this season. I was pretty open in my series overview that I think Season 2 is the worst individual season of any Star Trek show, full stop. But I got a little bit of pushback, so I decided to give it a second viewing, and I found that it worked less in a second viewing than it did even the first time around, which is its own level of disappointing, right? You have the return of Q, which he was an interesting character, and I kind of missed him, and they found a way to work him in that pilot episode kind of okay. And the pilot episode of Season 2 works fine enough. It's a direct sequel to the first season, but also kind of establishing a completely fresh roadmap of what this show plans to do, and finds ways to dispose of characters or sideline characters that don't really matter to the story that it's trying to tell. That was disappointing because I actually really quite liked some of the new characters they brought on board. But this season didn't seem to care about the new characters. It liked to play with Raffi a little bit, it liked to play with Rios a little bit, but they even kind of fall to the wayside of this Picard storyline, this Jurati storyline, which we'll touch on that in a minute, and the Jerry Ryan 7 of 9 continuation of her storyline. Now, of all the storylines in the entirety of Season 2, I think the strongest one is 7 of 9, because she's granted that one thing that she's never had in the past and explored through either Voyager or Season 1 of Picard, and that is a normal human existence, free of her Borg trappings. But Borg Trap this season does, as you find out that the Borg and the Borg Queen, which is back, is so layered into the plot that is meandering at best throughout this season. We have the reemergence of the Borg Queen and her infiltration of the character of Jurati. If you want to see character assassination for a character that was never really got her comeuppance in the first season, that was a criticism I had in the previous review that I did for Season 1, character assassination on this is pretty jarring. Like, why did they do this to her character? It didn't make sense. It doesn't flow well. It does nothing to recontextualize the Borg. And if you watch the first episode, where everything hinges on this incident, this irregularity or singularity or whatever they want to call it in the first couple of minutes of that first episode, it cannot be the resolution that eventually happens by the end of this season. It just can't. It doesn't make sense. There's no reason for there not to be some kind of communication brought forth. Now, maybe it's a communication that Picard won't believe, or Starfleet, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't want to buy into, but there's no reason not to make that communication, especially when you are what you are. And and then for her to go in and then just start like blithely killing these characters, and you don't even know it's Borg at this point. It's a mess. But the whole season kind of is that. No longer are we making commentary on the problems of our contemporary. Instead, we are using the anguished feelings that 2020 gave us to fuel this nightmare vision of a second season of Picard. But nowhere does it make any political statements or stances. It even sets this show in what is our current year. It is set as a contemporary show. Like, I guess it's a little in the future, as of this recording, you will be watching this in March of 2024, and this story takes place in April of 2024. But there's no point to set it in this modern time period. It just didn't make sense. Like, why do it other than to enforce, like, budget limitations? Because I imagine Picard is a pretty expensive show to make. It didn't make any political statements or stances or really anything. Any that it did were incredibly superficial and didn't matter to the story as whole. And it didn't... Besides getting the anguish of the COVID times, it did nothing to further its own plot or flesh out its own world, really. Other than to acknowledge that, yes, currently you are living in a turbulent time, but at some point in the future it'll get better. However, not for Picard, because Picard's whole experience in this season, both in the future, in this parallel timeline, and in the past, are all just filled with darkness. And what is this time period? I guess the closest you can explain this series' use of, is it time travel? Is it a parallel timeline, an alternate reality? We don't really know. The closest we can see and figure out what's going on is the explanation from The Flash that Michael Keaton's Batman gives, where he throws spaghetti noodles into a bowl and is like, each of these timelines intermingle and weave and stuff like that. That's why sometimes you look like this and sometimes you look like that. That maybe is the explanation for why Guinan looks nothing like Guinan when we see young Guinan. But also that directly refutes what we've already come to learn about Guinan's first interaction with both, Picard and also the world at large for Star Trek. It gets messy. Even messier is the pointless callback to the punk rock music dude on the bus listening to the stereo. Are you trying to tell me that in 2024, I ride the bus. I enjoy riding the bus. Public transit is one of my favorite things, and gets a bad rep. But anyway, I have been riding the bus since my early 20s. Never once have I seen a person with a boombox. Are you telling me that that same dude from Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, is still rocking a... Like, I get it's for the sake of a joke, but, like, why is that there? It's fan service at its absolute worst. And I cannot and could not stand it. And then all of this comes to play with Picard having weird mommy issues that sort of somewhat refute what was stated in the original season of Star Trek Next Generation, but exempting that. Like, why is that here? How did this... he's supposed to be 94 years old, they say, in one of the episodes. At 94 years old, he has never once discussed with absolutely anybody what went on with his mother and the tragedy therein. I call bunk. This is bad storytelling, trying to force these principles onto a character that doesn't warrant it, and it just doesn't make sense either canonically or non-canonically. It's just dumb. This whole season is trends on being unwatchable, and it's weird because, like, you have pretty strong performances, like John DeLance reprising his role as Q really helps to elevate everything that's going on here. Patrick Stewart is great as Picard. You have Jerry Ryan. You have all these people. Alison Pill sells what she can with this terrible storyline that's given to her. But I just feel bad for these actors to have to try and pull this off. And it's got to be so frustrating if you are the actor playing the characters of Jurati and Soji and and Rios. And poor Elnor, who I didn't really like to begin with, but like how they are being systematically wiped off of this show when they were so integral to the identity of the first season of it and its successes. The characters worked. It was inconsistencies with the storytelling and maybe some lackluster storytelling with that first season that were its drawbacks, but none of which came from character. This one kind of dismantles all those characters in meaningless ways and then gets rid of virtually all of them. probably never to be seen again or even referenced again in the case of Rios and Soji. And that's so weird. And then you bring back Brent Spinner again. Like, why? What does he serve to this story? He doesn't. It's just they wanted to work with him again, and they just created some more, like, lore for him to ancestrally, like, work off of. And it's convoluted and dumb by this point, if I'm being real. It was kind of dumb the previous season. It was definitely also kind of dumb when they did this in Enterprise, that they just always looked like Brent Spiner or everybody in his family line. And then they shoehorn in this somewhat clever reference to Star Trek Enterprise and the whole, what do they call it? I can't remember the name. The Khan knockoffs. And like they give some context or reference that may indicate a connection to Enterprise, which tickled me a little bit, but I also feel like maybe I'm giving them a little more credit because I don't think they've ever acknowledged Enterprise in this show in any powerful or profound ways, and that's another one that they're trying to forget. So much so that there's now been announced a prequel series that is going to be set about 100 years before Star Trek ever looking back. Like, come on, is this going to be essentially re-envision Enterprise? Probably, sadly. Even Strange New Worlds, which I heard is good, is just kind of repainting the original series of Star Trek until it's going to simply just become a retread of Star Trek, the original series. I'll eventually talk about that one. I would like to watch the show. I've heard very good things about it. But again, this need to look back has been something that is the most disappointing. And even when you have a show that is set in the future, it brings it back to this past, this dark time period. This is the same thing that swallowed up Star Wars and made it, like, uninteresting to the point where, like, we can only contextualize right before the original series of Star Trek or Star Wars happens. We know everything there is to know about the Clone Wars with the Bad Batch, with like Rebels and Rogue One and Obi-Wan and Andor and the prequel trilogy and stuff like that. Like we're just set in this 30-year period of time that we are obsessed with fleshing the F out, and I don't understand why. And Star Trek is doing the exact same thing. It's just giving us more and more and more and more and more context to the original series, but stripping that original series of what made it work. This swashbuckling adventure, this fun, this look at hopeful optimism at what the future might hold and can be if we show the way how. And I think that's why I'm really disappointed with Picard Season 2. I thought they laid the tracks for a really fantastic series with the first season, and they gave us Star Trek at its absolute worst by the end of Season 2. I hated it. Even the reprisal of, like, Whoopi Goldberg as Guinan, who's my favorite character in the Next Generation era. Like, besides the little tickle I got of seeing her again, that she was terribly misutilized. Same thing with, like, just literally all the characters, even providing an end to Q. All of which is going to be bought back, or has been bought back by the end of it, because death has no meaning in Star Trek anymore. That's been established, and I mentioned that in the previous video. But anyway, that's my once upon a time ramblings of what once was a great show and has since become Star Trek at its worst. Picard Season 2 is the darkest timeline. Now, if you like this season, try to explain to me what it is that I'm missing. What don't I get? Explain to me why you might enjoy it. Because I sure as hell didn't. I'm going to take a couple weeks off from, I'm going out of town, so I won't be able to have a review up in the next couple of weeks for Picard Season 3, but I'm super excited to re-explore the third season of the show. If ever there was a redemption for a television show, this is the one that kind of earns it. Check out, in a couple of weeks, my review for Star Trek Picard Season 3, and let me know what you thought of this film in the comments down below.